border battle continues over the Trump administration's zero-tolerance immigration policy that separates migrant children from their families who are trying to cross the border. President Trump still fighting the backlash, pointing fingers at Congress to change the laws. Meanwhile, the country is reacting in a very vocal way. Here is the breakdown. Protests continue around the country this morning. Hundreds of demonstrators expressing their outrage over migrant children being separated from their families at the U.S.-Mexico border. The sights and sounds from child detention centers, also known as tender age shelters, are currently holding hundreds of babies and toddlers. That news causing MSNBC News anchor Rachel Maddow to break down on air.
Trump administration officials have been sending babies and other young children. Oh, hold on. To at least three. Can we put up the graphic of this? Thank you. Do we have it? No. 3 tender age shelters in South Texas.
And the outrage didn't end there. Former Trump campaign manager Corey Lewandowski dismissed concerns on Fox News Tuesday night about reports that a migrant girl with Down syndrome had been separated from her mother at the border as a result of the White House's zero-tolerance immigration policy.
I read today about a 10-year-old girl with Down syndrome who was taken from her mother and put in a cage. I read about did you say want to a 10-year-old with Down syndrome being taken from her mother?
Pick anything you want out, but the bottom line is very clear.
The border crisis now calling on lawmakers and President Trump to change the laws and to end the practice. The president telling House Republicans that he is 1,000% with them as GOP leaders work to pass an immigration bill. And according to people who were in that closed-door immigration meeting on Capitol Hill with President Trump, he told the group he wants to see an end to his policy of separating undocumented children from their parents at the U.S.-Mexico border. No word yet on whether or not Trump will talk about the policy or immigration at his rally in Duluth today, but we're going to keep you posted on that. We do have a poll going this morning about how you feel about President Trump's visits, and right now most of you look like you're mad about it.